So I'm happy to be here today to talk about trust in science. We did a recent survey of the members of the National Academy of Sciences and asked them a number of questions in terms of issues that the NAS should address, issues in, such as climate change and environment, across the board in terms of possible big topics that the Academy should take on. The issue that was number one in polling, that members across the entire Academy felt it was most important for the NAS to take a leadership role on, was trust in science. More than 70% of our members felt it was the most important topic that the Academy should address, and over 90% felt it was either the most important or a very important topic for the National Academy to take on behalf of the scientific establishment. So for that reason, I'm very happy to come and talk to you about it today. So here's our main building in Washington, D.C. with the statue of Albert Einstein out in front. And the National Academy of Sciences was founded by Abraham Lincoln during the Civil War to provide advice to the nation on any matters for which evidence can provide better decisions, actions, and policy. And it is probably worthwhile to remember that evidence in decision-making really does matter. And trustworthy science does make a difference, and we can't lose that public trust in science because it is the bedrock and the foundation of good decisions. If instead our leaders were to decide that they're going to make decisions based on, this is my gut feeling, we really would be in trouble. So I want to give you a couple examples, just a few, of where basing decisions based on evidence actually has mattered. So here's one. I'm looking out here and I'm seeing a few of you are young. You probably don't remember a time when people smoked on airplanes. But there are many of you out here who are old enough to remember a time when airplanes had a smoking section in the back and a non-smoking section in the front. Well, once the dangers of secondhand smoking started becoming apparent, health advocates said, wait, we're all breathing the same air on these airplanes. Having a smoking section and a non-smoking section makes no sense. All the air is recirculated. So they said, we think it makes sense to ban smoking on airplanes entirely. So the FAA asked the National Academy to look into the possibility of banning smoking on airplanes entirely. Well, the National Academy, in its usual careful way, put together a panel that included not only people who understood the impacts of secondhand smoking, but also people who understood airplane engineering and the mechanics of airplanes, and people who understood something about how people would react to not being able to smoke for an entire airplane flight, oh my God, things like that. And the committee came back with the following recommendation. They said, well, we found out some very interesting things. The first thing they found out was that during normal airplane travel, the passenger compartment that is pressurized would develop small little pinprick holes in it, and it was only the tar and nicotine from cigarettes that would plug those pinprick holes. And if they suddenly banned smoking on cigarettes, smoking cigarettes, the passenger compartment would depressurize, and this would be a problem. So the committee recommended, in their wisdom, that the aircraft industry would require some time to improve the quality control in the construction of the passenger compartment, and they would need to find a solution to these pinprick holes. So they said, let's start by banning smoking on short flights, under 2 hours, give them time to fix this problem, and eventually ban smoking on longer flights. So that's indeed what happened. The problem with the pinprick holes was solved, and now we all fly on flights even to Beijing and Calcutta without, while still being able to breathe. So this was an example where evidence was able to make a good decision, and we're all healthier for it. So here's a second example, one that John brought up this morning when he talked about the rapid development of a drug to address HIV. This was, again, back in the 1980s, when there was an affliction that was impacting the health of, at that time, mostly gay men and HIV drug users in, at that time it was mostly in San Francisco and New York City. The National Academy of Sciences put together a report that said, this is not going to be a problem for just those communities, but it has every risk of becoming a public health epidemic that will sweep the nation and the world. And the US government has to do a whole list of things. It has to protect the blood supply by screening for this HIV virus. It has to stop the spread of the disease by doing a needle sharing program, by putting out information about how the disease is spread, and it has to immediately embark on finding a cure for the disease. At the time, the federal administration thought that this was a disease that was going to be confined to these communities, the intravenous drug community and the gay community. But to the administration's credit, they took the advice from the National Academy report, and they immediately started a public health education campaign, and they started working on a cure for AIDS. And what was amazing was the president at the time, Ronald Reagan, his motto was, government is not the solution to our problem, government is the problem. And yet, the US got a jump on what could have become a public health epidemic. And when you compare this to what was going on in the rest of the world, here is what life expectancy looked like in sub-Saharan Africa. This red line shows when the National Academy report came out. Life expectancy in most of these countries had been steadily climbing throughout the decades of the 60s and 70s, well into the 80s. And then life expectancy started tanking because of HIV/AIDS. But it did not happen in the United States. Whereas in many of these countries, you remember notably South Africa, where there was a denial that HIV caused AIDS. So this is a good example of evidence leading to good public policy. And then finally, this is just my last example. This was a report from 2009 when the National Academy was asked by the Department of Justice to look into the science behind forensic science. The report that came out was not very complimentary. It said that much of forensic science has basically no scientific basis. Of particular concern are eyewitness testimony, bite marks, the interpretation of blood spatter, and using hair samples, particularly hair samples without roots. You know, taking one piece of hair and saying, oh yeah, it came from the defendant there. Because of this report, 3,000 death row inmates are now having their sentences under appeal. Now, the report also recommended a research program to put forensic science on a more solid scientific basis, because the report said really only DNA evidence has a really solid basis, and most other, and fingerprints are pretty good, but most other evidence is on a very shaky foundation. And there was a commission set up in the Justice Department to oversee this scientific program. Unfortunately, that commission has been disbanded under the recent administration. So that's a sad day for using science for good public policy, and hopefully that will get reversed sometime soon. Not always has science evidence been followed, however. Some counterexamples are during the Spanish flu epidemic in World War I. The US government came to the Academy and asked for their advice of how to deal with this epidemic of flu that was going through the military. The Academy recommended changing the proximity with which troops were being barracked in order to stop the spread of the disease. The Army said, we're the Army. We put our troops in barracks. That's what we do. And in the end, more troops died from the flu than from enemy fire. Another example is just recently in 2016, we put a report out on the economic and fiscal impacts of immigration. That report also hasn't been used to guide the nation's current immigration policy. So, as I say, science can inform many critical issues, from feeding a population of 9 billion to dealing with natural disasters to our energy future. However, this will only happen if our nation's leaders and the public in general trust science. So there are many issues, though, that can impact the trust in science. Two that we've heard about today are misconduct and irreproducibility. Now, the globe on the left is from a three-dimensional world map of scientific misconduct in 180 countries. It's very difficult to look at the change in misconduct as a function of time. And the reason I argue that is that with the increase in the movement to make data, methods, materials more open and available, and the encouragement of authors to be more transparent, it's been easier to go back and look at when people have falsified their findings, and also growth of sites like PubPeer have also meant that the community is much more alert to looking for misconduct. The ability of people because papers are online, to scan images and look for evidence of manipulation of data. All of this means that we have more tools at our disposal to look for misconduct than we could in the past. So I don't think it's possible to do a meaningful comparison with time. But this paper was interesting because it did a spatial comparison. And they normalized it by the number of papers coming out of various countries. And the conclusion of this paper was that in those countries where the scientific enterprise is growing most rapidly, the rate of misconduct is the highest. So it's almost as though these countries are going through growing pains. And the growing pains of a rapidly expanding scientific enterprise means that they haven't been able to impose the appropriate checks and balances in their scientific enterprise to make sure that they've got the appropriate oversight to prevent misconduct. And they could have inappropriate incentives that are actually allowing misconduct to flourish. So that's what that globe on the left is showing. Still, overall, you can see that globally, most of the world has very low rates of scientific misconduct. Now, the one on the right is Richard Harris's book on irreproducibility. Despite the disparate inflammatory title of this book, if you can actually get beyond that, the book is actually a fairly interesting treatise on the issues of irreproducibility in science, and well worth the read because it's a very easy breezy read on some of the issues surrounding the irreproducibility problems and how we got where we are now and where we need to go and really what's at stake. So that is really the bigger issue rather than misconduct. So Brian, just while we were having lunch, talked about the norms of science. This is my own list of the norms of science, which I just kind of made up, but it's not all that different from the list that Brian gave you, which was based on a literature search. My list of norms of science was to base your findings on evidence, expose your work to critical review, share your results, show your data, be skeptical of your own results, and avoid bias. Results should be independent of the investigator. Now, what we've also heard is that, unfortunately, there's too much of what we see of the counter norms of science, where people cherry pick the evidence. So they've got a lot of data, but let's ignore that part of the data and just focus on this part of the data because I like this data. This data looks really good and fits my hypothesis, and I'm just going to ignore that stuff because that's going to mess up my really nice story. And we see too much of that happening. In terms of subjecting your work to outside scrutiny, too many stories of these peer review rings that people form, where I'm going to favorably review your paper, and you're going to favorably review his paper, and he's going to favorably review my paper, and everyone's in collusion. That's not a norm of science. And then hiding your results from the competition or not sharing it broadly, locking away your data, as we've already heard, defending your results at all costs until the day you die. Some of the people who are on, my Mount Olympus in terms of people that I admire most are people that, when it comes to some of the biggest controversies in my field, have changed their mind over which side of the controversy they're on 2 or 3 times over the course of their careers as new evidence has come to light. from different data sets and different systems. I think changing your mind shows that you are open to new evidence as opposed to defending your original stance as though it's a religion. Science is not religion, it's not a belief system. It is something that you have to assess the best evidence and come to independent conclusions. And then also inserting personal bias. Results reflect personal beliefs of the investigator. Again, enough's been said about that. Now, Brian showed a link to this paper, but didn't mention it. One of the first major leaps to promoting a more open and transparent system in science was the publication of this paper, the top guidelines, that came out in Science back when I was editor-in-chief. This came out in 2015. It resulted from a workshop that we had at the Center for Open Science. It was funded by the Laura and John Arnold Foundation. And the beauty of this paper was that it came up with a system of practices that were would promote transparency and openness in science. It allowed journals to sign up that they would support them at various levels. They could support them at a low level or a very stringent level, and then with time, implement them. So since 2015, so it's just 3 years later, more than 5,000 journals have signed on as supporting these principles. And a full 1,000 journals have actually already implemented them. And the beauty of that is that, and these journals are across all fields, fields from the social sciences to the physical sciences to the life sciences. These are society journals, they're for-profit journals, they're open access journals, they're journals of all types. And here are what the standards are. And I just annotated this to show how they promote the norms of science and discourage the counter norms. So for example, the citation standards say that you have to cite data, code, and methods, basically giving transparency on where to find, especially if it wasn't your own data, showing where you got what you used. Data standards, you can't lock away your data, you have to share it. Analytical methods, you have to provide your code. Research materials transparency, you have to provide your materials. Design and analysis transparency, you have to show what you did. All of this aids in reproducibility because someone else can come in and see exactly what you did, how you did it. They can either reproduce the study based on your own methods and materials, or they can reproduce it from start to finish collecting new data. And pre-registration of studies addresses the file drawer effect. When you pre-register that you're going to do a study, someone can come back later and say, you said you were going to do this, this study and look into this. I never saw it published. What happened to it? And then you say, oh, well, I got a negative result, so I didn't think it was worth publishing. Well, that's a good thing to know, that if someone at least got a result that was negative, then you can say, well, I'd like to see your data because I need to fold that into my slightly positive result to see what the actual sum total of all this says about whether this is effective or not. And Brian's talked about pre-registration of analysis plans to eliminate bias, and replication or reproducibility. So all of these are standards in the top analysis. And the fact that so many journals have signed on and showing what they're doing in this space has really been revolutionary, because as journals are saying exactly what they're doing, and most journals have signed on, in terms of actually requiring data and analytical methods and research materials, et cetera, is changing the culture. I also wanted to talk about transparency in authors' contributions. This was a paper that a group of us published in PNAS recently, to provide standards in authorship contributions. Let me contrast just two very different modes of understanding what people did. There's the typical way that we do things in science, where there's a paper that has all sorts of complicated stuff in it. It's got a design in it, it's got data collection, it's got data analysis, it's got all sorts of data visualization, it's got data interpretation, lots of very, very complicated science that went into coming up with the final result. Then we have a movie like The Martian that had a producer, a director, it's got stars, it's got people that did scenery, it's got stuntmen, it's got all sorts of things. In the credits for that movie, you know exactly who did what in that movie. And there's no question but that the producer was not the star, and the star was not the stuntman, and whoever did the costumes doesn't bear responsibility for what might be some errors in the script, etc. So why is it that the movie industry is so really, really good at giving credit where credit's due, and we as scientists are so sloppy at it? So that's what this paper was all about, is trying to say we need to move more towards a better system in science, because first of all, we want to give credit where credit's due, but also we've had too many cases where we need to pin the blame where the blame is due. And it's amazing how all the authors want to take credit when a paper is flying high, but how much they want to point fingers to everyone else when the paper runs into trouble. So it's best to assign credit when the paper is submitted and not try to do the forensic analysis of who did what after the fact if the paper runs into trouble. So that's what this paper is about. It's talking about providing standards for authorship, listing responsibilities for corresponding authors, adopting credit or some other way to provide who did what, requiring ORCID IDs. Does anyone here not know what an ORCID ID is? Okay, a couple people. So everyone here who's an American citizen probably has, even if you're not, you might have a social security number. A social security number is a unique identifier that says who you are for paying taxes and getting government benefits. An ORCID ID is an international number that can identify you within the research community for identifying you as an author. So if there are 5 H.P. Lees all over the world who are publishing, and you want to know which ones should be credited with which publications, there's no longer the confusion, because if they are each publishing and identifying themselves with their ORCID IDs, then each journal knows which HP Lee it is, the citations are being credited to the right HP Lee, etc. And what I would love to see is that ORCID IDs become the social security number for the international research community, that they not just be used by journals, but that they be used by funding agencies, that they be used to identify reviewers, so that if my dream is that someday we can start actually understanding which journals are doing peer review and which ones say they do peer review but don't do peer review, by doing random audits of journals and saying, I'm taking of your last 100 papers, this paper, that paper, and that paper, send us the ORCID IDs of the reviewers you used, and we'll contact those reviewers and make sure they reviewed those papers. And if based on the ORCID IDs, those people say they didn't review it, then you're in the timeout corner, and we're going to tell authors and funders that they won't pay APCs for your journal. So I think ORCID IDs are a great thing for everyone to have. Okay, so now we get to the 2017 word of the year, post-truth. Right now, we still have a high valuation of science with the public, but we are seeing cracks in this valuation. We heard in Great Britain that public officials saying, we're tired of experts. And we've heard with leaders in our own country that they're valuing feelings over scientific evidence. And so we've got these two trends, that feeling and intuition can be valued over scientific analysis, but we've always had the problem that non-scientists are disturbed when scientific conclusions change. All right. So here's what I wanted to discuss. How many of you have ever played the game Jenga? Okay, a lot of people know what this game is. You pile up all these wooden blocks and you make a tower, and then you see which blocks you can pull out from inside the tower and not have it tumble over. And you pile them up on top, and you keep going till the whole thing collapses. Well, I'm using this as an analogy for the scientific trust establishment, where, because I want to talk about trust in terms of three different parts of the scientific establishment, because I think when we talk about trust, we too glibly don't define, when we say, does the public trust science, we don't talk about what part of science we're talking about. Because there's the scientific method, there are scientific studies, and there's the scientific consensus. And those are three different elements of science, all of which are differently deserving of the public trust. So let's talk about the scientific method, which I call the base of everything. The scientific method is what Brian talked about first in the panel this morning, where you come up with a hypothesis, you come up with a method to test it, you gather data, you analyze the data, you say whether it supports your hypothesis or not, you present your findings to others, you let them test it. That's time-honored scientific method. Anyone can be a scientist if they sign on to using that method. We should all trust in the scientific method. And that is the bedrock, and that is, from time immemorial, the way that we have benefited from science and that society has benefited from science. We should trust in the scientific method, and that should not be necessarily, it should be, we're always, refining it for different fields, but that basically should be something that we trust. Then, at the very top here is the scientific consensus, which is based on all sorts of individual studies. Individual studies support a scientific consensus. And it takes a lot for scientists to come to consensus on anything. Scientific consensus is hard won. And it's hard to change it. But if enough of these individual studies are pulled out, eventually it will tumble. A scientific consensus will fall, and we call that a paradigm shift. And some new reigning hypothesis will come to replace it. And so it's not common that a consensus will change, but it does happen. But we should trust in the scientific consensus as well. Now, the individual studies are constantly being revised and overturned and reimagined and whatever. So I'm not concerned when someone doesn't trust an individual study. Individual studies are kind of thrown out there, and they need to be validated. They need to cook for a while. And to the extent that they kind of stand the test of time, then fine. But not all of them will. Some of them will get pulled out and not make it. So, so I think that's why there's confusion from the public, is because very often we talk about the scientific consensus and individual studies, and they think they should trust an individual study the same way they trust the scientific consensus, and that's wrong. That's just not right at all. So, John already brought up coffee this morning. So I admit I'm not a coffee drinker. There was this really bad experience in Mazatlan, spring break, junior year, with Kahlua, and I have never been able to even stand the smell of coffee since then. So I figure, based on his data, I'm probably going to die really, really, really young. But anyway, but look at the poor public. This is the kind of stuff they see. Coffee and diabetes. The coffee controversy, healthy or not, 7 hints you are at risk. Did you know coffee is good for you? Coffee is probably right up there with red wine. Red wine's good for you. Red wine's bad for you. No wonder the public is concerned. They see so much of this flip-flop that they don't know what to do. And the problem here is the following. What do they mean by good, and who is you? If you don't define good, and you don't define you, the statement is nonsense. Because what might be good and who is you can be very different for every single person in this room. So these are nonsense things. Okay. Now, let's talk for just a second here, because I'm probably running out of time. Yeah, about the two worlds. Let's talk about science in journals versus what the public wants. Okay, science in journals. It's only interesting if it is a major advancement on or an overturn of accepted views. You scan the table of contents of any journal, and you really want to read the paper if it's something brand new that is either a leap forward in your field or if it completely overturns it. If it's something incremental, it's probably not all that interesting. But what the public wants is they want affirmation. When things are reaffirming, it reduces confusion. Many were taught in school that science is an eternal body of facts. They weren't taught science as an inquiry-based way of knowing the laws of the natural world that is constantly moving forward. And so they get confused when things change. So these two are at odds. Science in journals. The scientist remains dispassionate. We're all taught to write our papers as though we're not there. There's no indication of the scientist there. And the reason is that, remember, back in the norms of science, the result has to be independent of the researcher. So we take ourselves out of the paper entirely, because if we're in there, then it looks like the result depended on us. But for what the public wants is the scientist in their story are interesting. They like to see a real person, and they like to sort of think that there's a real feeling person there who kind of cares about them and that is in some way benevolent towards society and what the real needs of society. And finally, scientists are very concerned about putting in all caveats and uncertainties, because that's the scientific method. You have to show why what you did might not be true and what the uncertainties are in what you came up with, whereas uncertainty makes the public think scientists don't know what they're doing. Well, wait, maybe this isn't right, so the public doesn't like that. So that's why there's this problem that we have between the way we're taught to do science and what the public wants to see. And so finally, the whole landscape is only getting more complicated because science is being disseminated now through very diverse channels, and we very poorly signal trust as we're getting the more diverse channels. I remember back when I started my career as a scientist, it was a simple rule. If you published in a peer-reviewed journal, then it was considered more trustworthy. And if you published in gray literature that was not peer-reviewed or just an abstract in a meeting symposium volume, then one did not know yet if it was trustworthy because it had not yet been peer-reviewed. And that's what we just would say. This has been peer-reviewed, that hasn't. This we put more trust in, this we don't know whether we trust it yet. Now the landscape has become more complicated because dissemination is done through online posting, through preprints, it's done through a variety of journals, it's done through journals that claim to do peer review, but we don't know whether they really have. Some of them probably haven't done peer review. And so the simple rules that we used to have about what's trustworthy and what isn't no longer apply. Furthermore, there have been so much said about the irreproducibility of even that has been peer reviewed that we know just saying that something's peer-reviewed so it should be trustworthy is obviously no longer right. So that leads me to say that there are all sorts of things we could do as a community to signal trust. So Brian already mentioned these badges that the Center for Open Science puts for open data, open materials, and whether the study's been pre-registered. But we could go even further than that in this electronic age of being able to signal what kinds of checks studies have had all along the pathway from preprints to even after publication. For example, we could mark whether something has gone through peer review, even the quality of peer review. Statistical review. Has a statistician actually looked at how the data were analyzed? The power of the data or the experiment, was it adequate? Has it gone through IRB review? Open data and materials check. Replication. Often it might be a year or more afterwards that the study could be replicated, but that could be, in this electronic age, that could be something that is shown after the fact and added to a study to show additional trust in the work. So I think that these are things that we should consider as a community in terms of increasing confidence in studies. So let me just finish with this, that science without policy is still science, but policy without science is gambling. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I was just going to suggest that there's time for 1 or 2 questions if anyone would like to bring those forward. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Kristen Coakley-Asher. I'm from the University of Pennsylvania. I work in an office called the Science Outreach Initiative. We aid a lot of faculty in the School of Arts and Sciences to find that interface between the public and scientists. I work on a lot of NSF grants and broader impacts. I was also a Mirzayan Fellow in 2012. I guess my question is related to the slide where you talked about the public mistrust of science and how they were interested in scientists as human beings. And I work at that interface a lot, and I was wondering if you could speak about what the national academies and then also what universities can do to support scientists in the tenure process of having to take time to do this sort of outreach work, and how that might ultimately help public trust in science if there was more outreach done.
Okay, so there are basically 3 things that give the public trust in science. One is that they have to feel that it is done competently. And scientists generally max out the competence scale, and we have a lot of checks on competence. But the other 2 things that the public needs to see are benevolence and integrity. And so I think those are the 2 things that we need to work on. Benevolence is they have to feel that the scientist somehow understands their problems and commiserates with, or at least embraces their issues, so wants to help solve their problems. And I think scientists sometimes come across as way too detached from what the public is feeling. So I think we have no problems with the competence, and I think we're addressing a lot of the integrity things, but we really have to work on that benevolence piece. And so the Academy is working, we've had a whole series of lectures on the science of science communication, and we're actually dealing with it as a formal problem, because there are experts that know how to actually know what the problems are and know how to train people to overcome them. So thanks for that question.
Steve Jaffe from Penn. You talked about lots of reasons why trust in science is at risk, but one thing you didn't mention is active efforts to undermine trust in science. Tobacco and climate change probably being the two best examples.
right.
Sorry to put you on the political hot seat, but of course, that's the nature of your position.
Yeah, right.
Wonder what your thoughts are.
Okay, so you're right that there are external efforts to undermine it. I really wanted to focus today on things that we as a community have directly under our control, as opposed to the things that are external to us. I do think that times when I've talked to people about climate change and other issues where they're hot buttons, here's the issue. People in Congress reflect the views of their constituents. And regardless of who is giving them money, if they think their constituents really don't support who that funder is, they're not going to follow that way. So look at all the people in California or Massachusetts or New Jersey or New York who will not take money from those vested interests because they know their constituents won't support it. So I do believe that if we can get to the public, we can neutralize the effect of those special interests. And the way to get to the public is start with shared values. So every time, I have lots of friends who are from parts of the country that don't necessarily buy into the climate science. But when I start by talking to them about shared values, what we want for our children, what we want for our grandchildren, it becomes a very easy conversation.